In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of the short story Instant Labor, published in Amazing Stories in 1999. You can find that in my collection, Last Week's Apocalypse, which is available on Amazon. I'm also the head of Sublation Media and the host of the Diet Soap podcast, the editor and writer of Critical Cuts, and, Man About Town. And with me today
is Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way It's Shot, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, the paperback for which is coming soon and going to be a lot cheaper than the hardcover has been.
Great. All right. So today we are going to be talking about Trump and how awful Trump is and how frightening he is. And the reason we're doing that is because Ezra Klein recently published an article just yesterday in the Sunday New York Times entitled "Stop Acting Like This Is Normal." And there's a picture of DC, of the, I think this is Senate there, colored red, blood red. So I want to know from you, Benjamin, what you find the most distressing about the Trump administration in this moment, if anything. And maybe we can walk through some of the allegations in this article by Ezra Klein. But have you seen it? I mean, I kind of sprung this on you at the last moment. Have you seen this piece or heard about it?
I've glimpsed it. I haven't read through the Ezra Klein piece. I have some concerns about the enormous amount of money that they dumped on ICE in the big, beautiful bill. Mm-hmm. That might actually increase the capacity of ICE to deport people because they actually have serious money behind those deportation efforts. It's difficult to tell from the statistics that we currently have to what degree that actually is going on already. It's something that is going to hit over time. So it's something that we're not going to be able to immediately evaluate from the standpoint of the September date that we're making this video. Also, the stuff to do with the trade war, the stuff to do with the tariffs, this kind of stuff is going to have effects that are not yet totally clear. Mm-hmm. And that's the stuff that I really pay attention to on a regular basis to see if there's emerging evidence of this stuff really having a discrete effect. I don't pay too much attention to the attempts to panic people with one-off video footage of this or that encounter that somebody has with a federal official. That doesn't tell us very much about what's going on at the macro level.
Yeah, I do think there's some things that should never happen. I think it should never happen that an ICE official doesn't show his badge and identify himself, when he's arresting someone, as an example, or detaining someone. So when I see even one example of that, I am distressed by it. And it makes me feel like perhaps there is a creeping authoritarianism. And of course, there has been a creeping authoritarianism since at least 9/11, which now I understand was more than 10 years ago.
Since Pollock wrote State Capitalism, its possibilities and limitations.
Right. But let's go through some of the things that Ezra Klein says one by one here. So the first thing he says is that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, was chainsawing its way through the government back in March. Civil servants were being fired left and right. That's where he starts. And I think that's an interesting place to start because I think it demonstrates his priorities. Because DOGE, the way I understand DOGE, looking back on it, and even at the time, was that it was not it was about politics. It was about clearing away Trump's perceived political enemies out of the executive branch, restructuring the executive branch more in line with this theory of the unitary executive, and taking control over that bureaucracy as best as he could. And that the outrage about it, I mean, there were other things that Doge was doing, and you would say providing cover for the big beautiful bill, but I also think it was about the politics of control over the executive bureaucracy, and that change doesn't strike me as particularly upsetting, or to be the kind of change that would limit my freedom or the freedom of everyday people in civil society to a greater degree than it was being limited before.
One of the great big dividing lines right now among people is whether they think the president poses a greater threat to democracy and freedom in the country, or the impersonal bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
And this conceptualization of democracy, do you think that the issue is that the system is too presidential, or do you think it's too bureaucratic? This is a long-running debate that has gone on for decades in political theory, that comes up and flares up again and again in different democracies. I don't really regard that debate as having an obvious single correct answer. I think that there's legitimate space for disagreement, and at different points in different contexts, you might find one of the sides in that debate more persuasive than the other. It's not something that I think you're going to be able to produce a consensus on broadly among the public, but they're not really trying to do that. Part of what's going on is that there is an attempt to intimidate the federal workforce, that the Democrats, in being alarmist about the Trump administration's Doge behavior, contributed to, because they inflated the threat of it for the purposes of trying to frame the administration as authoritarian. They contributed to a perception of an enormous level of threat, and therefore helped the administration scare and frighten civil servants. The same thing goes on with immigration, where when the Democrats exaggerate the degree to which the president is having success with his immigration policy, when we really don't have a very good statistical sense yet of the degree to which the administration's immigration policy is succeeding. And the same also goes for these sending of National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. If you greatly exaggerate the degree to which this stuff is disruptive and frame it as this terrifying fascist attack, it makes it more effective at generating fear and in creating a perception that the president is being very active and is doing a lot of things, when really oftentimes what the president is doing is trying to put on a show to cover up what he isn't able to do, or at the very least has not yet been able to do. He has not yet been able to deport millions and millions of people. He's not yet been able to establish control over blue cities, which are overwhelmingly still controlled by Democrats in terms of city councils, in terms of mayors, in terms of state governors in many cases. So by framing all of this as a terribly successful authoritarian thing, the Democrats in some ways facilitate what the administration is doing and encourage the administration to do more of it, because the administration knows if it puts on a big show, the Democrats will cooperate in framing it as very dominant and successful.
Right. Just to pause on the question of the unitary executive, I remember that the last time this was an issue that I paid attention to anyway, it was under the Bush administration, and it had to do with the way Bush and Cheney were grabbing executive authority and arguing for unitary executive in order to implement their policies around the war on terror. And it did include the intimidation of bureaucrats and intelligence officers and so forth, in order to make sure that the invasion of Iraq and the justification for the invasion of Iraq wouldn't be questioned internally. That there would be a consensus amongst both parties and within the executive and within other countries like the UK to go ahead with the invasion. And at that time, in that context, I was dead set against the unitary executive theory. Right? I thought the Congress and even the lifelong bureaucrats like Valerie Plame's husband say were more reliable in terms of acting in my interest by telling the truth or something like that, right? And then, but today, after the Biden administration, after the way in which the Biden administration has gone after dissent around Ukraine, implemented instruments of social control online, uh, made sure that, well, those are the two that really come to mind: the arresting of dissidents who oppose the war in Ukraine and the massive censorship efforts that were undertaken. I am tending to not be so critical of the idea of the unitary executive. And I guess am I just being opportunistic here? What do you think?
Well, I think it's unwise to fetishize any particular procedural schema. The democratic procedures that are functional or appropriate in one context will be dysfunctional and inappropriate in a different context. Different kinds of procedures, different ways of structuring democracy are necessary at different points in historical time. And therefore, I don't think that it would make sense to be completely wedded to one single rigid scheme or one particular understanding of one particular rigid scheme, which is why, for instance, for a long time, it was the liberals who supported judicial revisionism, changing interpretations of the Constitution on the basis of historical context.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, not being completely bound by precedent and not feeling as if you have to interpret the Constitution in line with something like originalism, a particular original meaning that existed through time immemorial. Oftentimes, people try to resist changes by latching on to a kind of notion of the way that it used to work at some point in the past, and insisting that this is permanent or transhistorical and it must always be interpreted in precisely the same way as having precisely the same implications. Really, the question is right now, given the way the world is working, the way the United States is operating, what kinds of institutions are necessary for the United States to be able to respond in an effective way to the problems that it presently faces? And if the institutions are not operating in a way which allows the United States to respond, then there will be efforts to revise the institutions or to revise the way the procedures are interpreted to try to generate dynamism. Mm-hmm. Those efforts might be contradictory. And I think one of the things that we have seen in recent years is that people have very different ideas about how to generate dynamism in the United States. Mm-hmm. And have therefore pursued different and conflicting institutional paths, procedural reform paths. And the easiest way to try to win arguments about procedural reform in a democracy is to say that somebody else's procedural reforms are authoritarian. Somebody else's procedural reforms are a slippery slope that leads to communism or leads to fascism. And we just see that all the time now.
Right. So the next bit that demonstrates his authoritarian character would be the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Then it goes, we can just, if you want to say something about that, I guess you can, but.
There was a recent not Supreme Court, specifically not Supreme Court, federal court decision challenging the legality of the tariffs. And the president expressed serious concern about that. And what we will see is appealing of that decision, and potentially it will end up in the Supreme Court. And then potentially, if the Supreme Court rules against the tariffs, the administration will have to find some other justification for the tariffs or give up the tariff policy. It seems that the administration acknowledges that the Supreme Court can curtail what it can do, and that ruling from that federal court is a potential problem if they don't get a different ruling out of the appeals process or find some other alternative legal justification for the tariffs. The administration seems to have consistently acknowledged its concerns about Supreme Court rulings that are not ultimately in its favor. It seems to recognize that that would, in fact, be a problem for it if that were to occur.
Right. I want to raise this. Someone says the answer about whether Doug is going soft on the executive is opportunistic. It is evidence Doug said it's because of this particular issue. Well, that's one way to put it. And I did raise my stance as opportunistic. However, what also changed was my trust of the so-called neutral aspects of the executive branch that would be fact-based,
I don't think you had in the first place the kind of position that is being attributed to you. I don't think in the 2000s that you had the view that objectively in every circumstance, the executive should play a particular role within the constitutional scheme. I think in the 2000s, you were motivated by concerns about ongoing issues like the war on terror and the Patriot Act and so on and so forth. And in the same way now, you're concerned about ongoing issues. There are different ongoing issues. I don't think you were ever a procedural fetishist who had a very rigid notion of what the executive's role is.
But in the 2000s, not to give myself too much credit for being consistent, in the 2000s, I think I did believe more that the power of the Congress to enact, vote for war was important, that it was a constitutional check on the deranged presidents that we would get from the Republican Party. And that I also believed that there was such a thing as apolitical intelligence reports that would come from people like Valerie Plame's husband, right? That there was a way for the lifelong bureaucrats to actually rise above political concerns and be neutral. I think I believe that. And then now I look back and say, oh, you know what? I'd rather have the person implementing these policies be have to run for office rather than be in this position of making law basically without ever having the answer to the people.
Well,
So
you do sometimes talk about intelligence reports as coming from sources that you consider trustworthy, like the Mueller report, for instance. You consider that credible.
Right. I think I do think there is a pressure on the intelligence community in general to get it right. I think that, but I also think that there are times now that it's been demonstrated where the intelligence community can be shown to be politicized. But the way you evaluate that is not based on it's not based on who is talking. But what kind
sometimes
of
they get stuff right and sometimes they get stuff wrong. When they predicted the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they got that right. When they said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, they got that wrong. So there's a situational aspect here. And if you, in an attempt to be consistent, had claimed that the intelligence reports are always right or always wrong, or that they're always trustworthy or never trustworthy, that consistency would come at the price of actually having a possibility of being accurate. There's a prudence question here that I think the question from the audience member overlooks, which is that the appropriate way politically to respond depends on the situation. That's not inconsistent. That's valuing, prudently looking at the situation.
Right. And in both cases, like when it came to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, it was possible to look at the quality of the evidence being offered up from the intelligence community, indicating there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and note the amount of dissent there was really around that internally. So the low quality of the evidence being offered by the intelligence community at that time, and the internal dissent from experts who had more direct access to evidence, like Valerie Plame's husband, that mattered. And it matters again today when it comes to the Russiagate scandal. You do have to evaluate the quality of the evidence, and you can rely institutions that are designed to be able to gather evidence to have the capacity to gather good evidence. And
so oftentimes intelligence services will tell you their conclusions, but they won't give you all the details about how they reach those conclusions. So you'll be put in a situation where you don't have enough information to independently evaluate the claim. That was part of why so many people got the Russian invasion of Ukraine wrong. The intelligence services asserted that something was going on. They didn't provide all of their work. They didn't show us in any kind of detailed way how they had reached that conclusion, but they said, you should believe us, this is what's going on. And then lots of people said, well, you got Iraq wrong on the basis of flimsy evidence, so you're probably getting this wrong too. And then they were not right.
Yeah, but I mean, in the Iraq case, there was internal dissent and alternative. There were alternative facts that you could access and that were more credible, where the work was shown to a larger degree. In the same case applies.
In part because there was a longer duration to that discussion, and there was an effort to present evidence in front of the United Nations, and a lot of those steps just aren't really taken anymore.
Right, and in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, there was nothing being debated really in terms of the U.S. response to that.
There's a question about whether Biden should take the meeting that Vladimir Putin was offering to have with him, but that didn't get discussed very much.
Well, and that wouldn't hinge on whether or not there were plans to invade. I mean, that might have been a decisive intervention to, stop the invasion. But
if you thought the credibility of the Russian troop movement might give you a reason to want to have the discussion.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go back though. Let's go back to the Ezra Klein here. So the next thing that he mentions is that the main thing that he's talking about is that Trump is an authoritarian, and he mentions the National Guard, the use of the federalization of the police in Washington, D.C. primarily, but it also occurred in Los Angeles. And that's not something we've talked about on this channel before, but we should talk about it because it is troubling, I think, that for the National Guard to be used in this way with a flimsy pretext. What do you make of that?
The state of Illinois is going to be challenging that in court, and there will be some kind of legal resolution to the state of Illinois' claims with regard to this, because the Trump administration has attempted to do this in Chicago, and Pritzker and the Attorney General in Illinois have decided to try to take this into the courts and see what the courts say about it. So that's something that remains as yet unresolved at the point at which we're talking about this. I do think that the aim of it is to create a mess in places where there's a very, very overwhelmingly Democratic voting bloc. So these are people that are not going to vote Republican in any case, to muck their lives up and bother them and intimidate them a bit, to do this in a telegenic way, which can be portrayed as being about enforcing the law or preventing crime or going after migrants or whatever. It doesn't have to do very much of that. What it does is it produces a lot of media attention around the Trump administration being very proactive. It seems to be doing something. It seems to be on the move. And it seems to be responding to concerns that Republican voters have about crime and violence and danger in the cities. It doesn't matter that the cities are statistically safer than they have been. The Republicans don't believe the statistics about crime anyway, and don't really care about those statistics. They highlight particular stories of particular people being murdered in various gruesome ways, and on that basis think that the cities are terribly dangerous. And they watch television news reports in the evening that tell them that this is the case, and they go along with it. So if you look at polling about how the public as a whole feels about the Trump administration sending troops into these cities, you get polls that show something like 54% approval for that move nationally. Whereas, of course, people in the blue cities where it happens experience it as a disturbance, experience it as disruptive, are intimidated or frightened of the guards. The primary function of it is to create a show that the Trump administration thinks it benefits from at the national level. And in framing it as a very disturbing and scary and frightening thing, the Democrats participate in making that show work. If instead it was just highlighted that this is a waste of money that disrupts commerce in these cities, it's just a stupid symbolic gesture that costs a lot of money and causes all sorts of festivals and parades and things that typically go on in these cities to not happen, so that all this economic activity doesn't take place, then I think it would be rendered banal and kind of pointless in a way that would be more politically tractable if we're talking about opposing this kind of thing. But if you participate in, oh my God, they're doing crazy law enforcement stuff and they're arresting enormous numbers of people and it's not safe to leave your house, all of this just contributes to the effectiveness of it, and it causes more people who run businesses in Chicago and in other cities to have to forgo that business because the customer base is scared by the media into not.
How could we tell if the use of the National Guard in this way was setting up a more authoritarian police state situation, rather than just being a kind of political theater to give the impression of activity when really there isn't a way to address the underlying problem that's apparently being addressed in this way?
Well, I think if they were sending the guards not to make a show, but to overthrow the mayor of Chicago and depose him and replace him with somebody else, or to control the decisions that he makes, or they were lining up all of the aldermen in Chicago and locking them up, or they were deposing the governor of the state, or forcing the governor of the state to take a decision under duress. But what they do is they make a disruptive show of force, and then they leave.
Okay, that's good. That helps. That clarifies that. One thing I'll say about the crime stats is that it is more difficult to truly know what the crime rates are than we think, and they are often politicized, and it comes down to how the police are trained to report crimes and what category they can put them in, and what's being enforced and what isn't being enforced, what crimes they're looking for. The one stat I've heard that's pretty easy to confirm and is most likely true is a homicide rate, because in that case there's a body or there isn't. But you can't really say, oh well, the rate of homicide has gone down when it hasn't. You're not.
And it has gone down in recent years after an uptick. Immediately during and around the pandemic, the homicide rate has come back down a ways. And if you were to look at the homicide rate, it hasn't been in the United States anything like the rate that it was in the early 90s and before. The 20th century, which many people are nostalgic for when discussing the cities. They go, oh, remember what the cities were like back in the legacy century. In point of fact, the cities had enormously high homicide rates in the legacy century relative to what they have today. We don't really have any concept of the level of violence that used to occur in American cities.
Well, I do. I'm old enough to remember, and I'll tell you the way it works with this nostalgia is, on the one hand, what you're nostalgic for is the authenticity and the diversity of businesses, and the lower rents and the pockets of Bohemia.
And the many different kinds of violence that used to occur, done by many different groups, including the mob. And now there seems to be a uniformity to the kind of violence that occurs. It only occurs in certain areas. It usually involves gangs that have something to do with drug trafficking. It's been confined to particular neighborhoods and particular organizational types. The violence that occurs is boring and too homogenized now.
Right. That's right. It was more interesting. The violence, although there was always a gang racial component to it, and that was pitched pretty hard in the 80s. But I would just say that people miss New York in the 70s. Like, they have nostalgia for the New York art scene, say, in the 70s. But what they forget was that was made possible by the collapse in New York City and the complete dysfunction of New York City.
I've got an old Series 3 Jaguar XJ6 that's got 2 gas tanks, from 1985.
Mm-hmm.
And the gas tanks have locks on them so that you can prevent somebody from, while you're stopped in traffic in the city, opening up your gas tank and siphoning your gas.
Right. Right. Yeah. That was a real concern. I mean, even if it was, maybe a bit of theater at the same time, because it's probably not that likely to happen. But yeah, no, the things were in some ways more open, and in some ways a lot rougher. And although, who knows? We could fall back to that level again. I think it's not out of the question. And yeah, I mean, so it would be worth looking at the way, and if there's a cyclical character to rates of crime over the last.
And what you'll also
150
find
years.
is in the European countries that have homicide rates that are roughly 1/5 that of the United States today, people still talk about crime as if it's very likely to happen to them. The level of fear and worry about crime really doesn't have anything to do with how often crimes take place, which is why the administration understands it doesn't have to actually do anything to reduce the crime rate to satisfy people who are concerned about crime. It just needs to do performative stuff that makes it look like it cares.
Right. Yeah. I used to work downtown in Portland for the Oregon Symphony, and I would call out to the suburbs to try to get people to buy tickets to go. And in certain parts of Portland or neighborhoods outside of Portland, suburbs like Beaverton and Tigard and Lake Oswego, you would hear frequently that they would love to come, but they're afraid to go downtown. And I lived downtown. I walked home from my job every night. I had never experienced any crime or seen it much, but there were homeless people downtown, and they didn't look good. So I think that was.
I live in Northwest Indiana, and there are lots of people who are scared of going to Chicago or going to Michigan City or Gary. It's very silly, of course.
Mm-hmm.
As the son of Illinois expats, I recognize it is very silly. But nevertheless, this is a very common way of thinking in the country, which the president can politically exploit.
Right. All right. So the next thing I want to bring up from this Ezra Klein, well, he talks about all the ways in which Trump is going after his enemies in the government, and how unique that is.
Perhaps the most interesting one is the going after the Federal Reserve Board of Governors member.
Okay, yeah, tell me more about that.
So the Federal Reserve for quite a while now has not been moving the interest rates downward to the degree that Trump would like to see. Trump is concerned about the interest rate being too high, therefore housing being too expensive, and this causing people to be dissatisfied with the way the government works. So he has been asking in increasingly public and demanding ways for the Federal Reserve to lower the rate. By convention, the president is not supposed to try to get the Federal Reserve to do anything. The president is supposed to be glad that the Federal Reserve has assumed responsibility for the rate, and therefore he can't be blamed for it. But of course, in point of practice, people do blame the president for the way the economy is operating, and therefore the president does sometimes have a desire to control and manipulate the rate. There's a consensus among the very serious, reasonable establishment people that the Federal Reserve should be independent of any political influence, that it should work in a completely technocratic way on the basis of economic science, and that any attempt to politically touch it or mess with it threatens the credibility of the entire economic program of whoever it is that's doing this touching and messing with it. So in trying to go after this Federal Reserve person for corruption, he has raised the possibility that he is looking for a pretext to try to intervene in the composition of the Federal Reserve Board. And of course, this is the president who stopped all appointments to the WTO appellate body, So he is somebody who's willing to putz around with the institutions that are supposed to not be political, although it must be emphasized that Biden continued his policy of not appointing anybody to the WTO appellate body, and that Barack Obama set a precedent by refusing to reappoint 2 different appellate body members to second terms, which had previously been a precedent that everybody had followed, an automatic second term for anybody on the WTO appellate body who gets a first term. So I think that there's, some reason to think that maybe he is testing to see if he can potentially influence the composition of the Federal Reserve Board by going after somebody who's not the chair of the Federal Reserve. He doesn't attract as much negative attention. And because there is an anti-corruption pretext, there's a basis that he can appeal to that I have no idea what the validity of that is. I have no.
What's the allegation? Do you know what the allegation is?
Some kind of white collar crime that she's alleged to have committed. I know nothing about whether or to what extent she did or didn't. This is not something I am qualified to investigate. So I don't know anything about the credibility of that. What I do know is that there is a perception politically that it's motivated by a desire to control the Federal Reserve Board. And of course, if we were to go back to the world of politicized interest rates, then you would have the democratically elected representatives much more directly responsible for economic conditions. A major part of why they, in the first place, made the central banks independent was to avoid being blamed or credited to this degree with economic conditions, to have the excuse of, well, I can't do anything about this because the Federal Reserve rate is too high or too low. Of course, over time, what that does, if you blame the Federal Reserve all the time, is it causes people to view the Federal Reserve as this evil, corrupt institution that's ruining their life. And there's loads and loads of people in the country now who think this way about the Federal Reserve. And given enough time, this can produce a demand to end the Fed or take back over the control of monetary policy. If you do that, you then can't hide behind the Federal Reserve as a shield for everything anymore. So and the same kind of thing happened in the UK with Brexit, the use of the European Union as a perpetual excuse for the way the economy works, which works because to some degree it's true. But then if you take that shield away, then all of a sudden the government is much more directly responsible for economic conditions. And what's been the effect in the UK? British governments are extremely unpopular continuously now, and they have fewer excuses.
Well, I'm for this then. I think that the Fed should be politicized on that basis alone. I am surprised and not surprised, but it is worth remembering that after the 2008 economic crisis hit, Alan Greenspan testified that he was taken unawares and that it proved that his entire theory and worldview was wrong. So, I mean, when Alan Greenspan admits that this economic science is based on the wrong worldview and has to be reconsidered,
And then, you just fight, he's gone and you appoint somebody else as chair. And then you say, look, we have a totally new policy now because Greenspan is gone. The Greenspan Fed is over with. You just flush it. And they do the same thing with Fauci. Pin everything that's going on Fauci and then flush him if it becomes too unpopular.
Right. But the point is that the theory doesn't really change. The science is pretty much the same from one Fed head to the next, right? I mean, I don't know if there's been a major shift from the, Milton Friedman style, Ayn Rand.
And the Bernanke Fed was more interested in Keynesian revivalist stuff. There was the quantitative easing that the Bernanke Fed did. There was some playing around with unconventional monetary policy.
Yeah, but that quantitative easing could be fit into a Friedmanite neoliberal framework as well. I mean, it
could be, though. At the time that it came out, there was a lot of fuss from people more in the libertarian side of neoliberalism. A lot of concern about it, the thought that it would necessarily be inflationary, that it was just money printing. And then, of course, because of the conditions under which it was occurring, the post-2008 conditions, it didn't have those effects.
Right. All right. So So that one's interesting. Do you think that the outcome will be, first of all, can the Democrats make any hay out of that? Obviously not. I mean, Ezra Klein didn't mention it, right? He mentioned,
it's going to be a lot harder to talk about members of the Fed Board of Governors that are not the Fed chair, because the public is not generally made aware of these kinds of people. For the same reason, nobody made any hay in American domestic politics out of Trump in the first administration, causing the WTO appellate body to become completely dysfunctional by refusing to appoint anybody to it. That was a gutting of the functionality of one of the major pieces. The appellate body allowed the WTO to impersonally, rules-based, multilateral order enforce all of these trade agreements in a way that had been perceived to be neutral by everybody except increasingly the United States and some of the African states who also have not joined the interim arrangement, but and some states in Southeast Asia as well. Anyway, the point of all of this is this kind of stuff, where when he actually does touch up or mess with these technocratic bodies that the public doesn't generally know very much about or discuss very often, that doesn't tend to get attention. But if he goes and does something that transgresses against what an elected official wants to see, like the governor of Illinois or the mayor of Chicago, then there's a whole bunch of fuss.
Right. So what there is fuss about from Ezra Klein here is the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics being fired on the basis of allegations that are apparently baseless, that the head cooked the books to make Trump look bad.
There have been some debates recently about the quality of the BLS research. It's probably not in the administration's long-term interest to generate broad distrust of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics creates a shared basis under which people can discuss policy. And if you gut the credibility of the BLS statistics completely, then you'll get into a stage where nobody is able really to discuss anything, because everybody's numbers will just be made up and nobody will know what's going on and everything will just be vibes. So even though the BLS statistics are in various ways imperfect, there is a potential damage that can be done in discrediting them, even if on some level they kind of deserve it.
Right. Well, the question would be, look, when I hear Trump say, this was done to undermine my administration. They revised the job figures in order to make it look like I had done much more poorly than I had in the last few months. And they did the opposite towards the end of the Biden administration. They puffed up the numbers. I don't tend to think that he's necessarily lying or just making that up out of
I don't think that the BLS did that. But there have been other debates about the quality of some of the BLS data. There have been adjustments. Oftentimes there's initial data that comes out, and then there's an adjustment to the data some months
That's what
later.
happened in this case,
and
right?
The
That's what he's so
adjustments
mad
have been
about.
large, and those large adjustments can create a perception of political tinkering with the numbers. But really what a large adjustment says is that the BLS is not doing a very good job with its initial figures. Which is itself a legitimate problem, that the BLS is making adjustments that are so large that the original narrative that comes out when the initial data comes out becomes inappropriate. The media reporting is going to be much stronger on the initial data release than it is going to be on any adjustment that subsequently takes place months later about the conditions in the economy 3 months or 6 months ago.
Now, because Trump's firing this person, has fired this person, now that adjustment is a big story.
But the long-term knock-on effect of this is just a general reduction in trust for federal statistics. This is something that has been going on for a long time. During the Obama administration, the libertarians who were committed to the idea that QE, quantitative easing, would produce broad inflation, insisted repeatedly that all of the inflation statistics and data were fake, so that they could persist in having this view long past the point at which there was any question about the data potentially supporting it. So you can get into difficult situations where you'll have an endless pile of zombie arguments because nobody has any kind of statistical baseline with which to operate. Even if the statistical baseline is imperfect in various ways, it's useful to have something that you can talk about with other people with whom you disagree.
Well, I think it does matter how imperfect we're talking
Yes,
about.
it does. And that's a context relevant thing here. And there
Yeah.
could be legitimate disagreement about whether the BLS numbers are so imperfect that the whole organization deserves to be badly discredited. But once you get into this kind of terrain, what will be the consequence of not having any kind of consensus on whether the BLS numbers are good enough to operate with?
Well, you'd have to have a political movement that had enough support so that some new version of the BLS could be put together that would have more.
Yeah, and that's what we tend not to have. So what will happen is that people will discredit something. They have no plan to replace it that commands enough support from the public that it's really genuinely politically viable. You shatter the consensus on the viability of something, and then it gets replaced with nothing. This happened, for instance, with the elections in 2020 when all of this vote by mail stuff was brought in so that the people who were afraid of the virus could vote from home. This looked like a political effort by the Democrats because people who were afraid of the virus skewed politically Democratic. It seemed as if it was an attempt to alter the election. And then because the vote count occurred on a time frame that was not normal, it took longer to count the votes because there were so many new absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. This produced a breakdown in trust with respect to the voting system. And then what happens? The Republicans say, well, how about we go back to the rules prevailing before the pandemic? And the Democrats then say that's voter suppression because that makes it harder to vote, which it does. So now you have a case where there's really no consensus about what the rules should be with regard to mail-in or how long it should take to count the votes in a presidential election. And all of this makes it harder to establish who won and makes it more likely that you'll have bands of people doing weird stuff out of derangement about their narratives, who they think won. So a lot of the time you break something for a potentially legitimate reason, but then you can't actually replace it with a new consensus. A lot of our consensuses are fragile in this sense now. If you break them, they don't come back and they don't get reconfigured. They're just gone.
Well, I don't know if there's a consensus on that point of view, but what I'll say is that that the big point of the Ezra Klein piece that I want to run past you here is that the Democrats, oh, come on, listen to me. I said no, the Democrats should basically shut down the government and refuse to pass a new budget in the next couple months. That they need to do this on the basis of stopping Trump's authoritarian attempts to reconfigure the government in his own image, and that is absolutely necessary, that what Trump is doing is not normal, and then for the sake of democracy, the Democrats need to oppose the next budget. What do you make of that?
He sounds like an Obama-era Republican.
Yeah.
Probably all of this QE, stimulus, Keynesian stuff, it's not normal, and it's going to create a horrible level of debt that will destroy the country ultimately, and therefore you have to vote down the budget and shut it down until he agrees to make budget cuts. It was effective because in 2011, he acquiesced to the Budget Control Act. You can potentially, through that tactic, extract something from the president.
Okay, but I don't see here something that particular that they are trying to extract. There's so many
that
different
might be
complaints.
revealed in a conversation that would take place. Of course, to be able to do this credibly, you'd need control of one of the houses of Congress. You're not going to be able to do this very easily with a minority in both houses. But if you, in the 2026 midterm election, picked up the House, you could then, through your control of the House, create a mess and then try to use that mess to get something from the administration. but it would probably be some kind of bureaucratic bargaining thing that would happen behind closed doors, that there would be reports on from outlets like the New York Times and Forbes and the FT and so on, but you wouldn't get any kind of big public movement behind those demands. It would be something that the leadership of the Democratic Party would negotiate behind closed doors with Trump, and then it would be revealed through the press what it is that the Democrats in practice extracted.
We have to take into account this is Ezra Klein writing this piece, right? So he's not really in a position to be setting policy at all, or setting up a political strategy.
No, he's trying to legitimate the Democrats employing a tactic that has been to this point associated with the Republicans. So he's trying to make it easier for them to adopt that tactic if they choose to do so in the future.
Right, but on what basis is he doing that, Mr. Abundance? What is he hoping to gain for his faction within the political process, within the Democratic Party, by coming out and arguing in this way? I think we should also ask, what does Ezra Klein gain from making this appeal, especially if it isn't taken up? Because I do think that some appeals are made in order not to be taken up. A good portion of the progressive left's appeals are made with the intent that they wouldn't be.
Well, it signals that he is with the base in terms of his level of alarm. One of the things that causes Democrats or Democrat-leaning people to not like us is that we don't mirror the affect that they have. So they are feeling very upset all the time, and we don't mirror that affect. So in mirroring that affect, there is a pictorial representation element to this. There's a looking like, seeming like, acting like the people that you represent. And so to associate the abundance movement with the affect of the base creates a linkage between the base and the abundance movement that is not on the basis of agreeing with a policy argument, but is instead on the basis of a shared attitude.
Right. And I think there is a general consensus within the Democratic Party that their base has, I'm going to put it this way, has Trump derangement syndrome. That the base really likes it when the party reacts as if the sky is falling.
Cory Booker his whole strategy is to mirror the affect of this kind of person, to get really angry and to act as if he is potentially being assaulted by an authoritarian state. And that's his whole strategy. But of course, why does somebody like Gavin Newsom think that he can win the 2028 presidential election? Gavin Newsom went on all kinds of podcasts talking about electoral strategy and is now deploying a different kind of messaging technique to get himself a lot of national attention. Why is he doing that? Because he thinks there will be a competitive multi-party election in 2028 that he might potentially win. In point of fact, the bulk of these Democrats are jockeying for position in a party that they think is going to potentially win competitive multi-party elections in 2026 and 2028. And if the Democratic Party can potentially win those elections, then you do not have some kind of totally authoritarian system in which one party or one particular person has established permanent rule.
Yeah, it's funny. Gavin Newsom is saying he doesn't think there will be an election in 2028.
And yet all of his behavior suggests that, of course, he believes that there will be an election in 2020.
Right. It's pretty funny. I want to read this excerpt from the we can't say this is normal essay in the Times. Senator John Ossoff of Georgia did a pretty good job of stating the problem back in July. Corruption is why they just defunded nursing homes to cut taxes to the rich, he told a crowd of his supporters. Corruption is why you pay a fortune for prescriptions. Corruption is why your insurance claim keeps getting denied. Corruption is why hedge funds get to buy up all the houses in your neighborhood, driving you out of the market. And then your corporate landlord ignores your calls during a gas leak. Corruption is why that ambulance costs $3,000 after you just had to get your choking toddler to the hospital. So Trump promised to attack a broken system, Ossoff continued. I get it, ripe target. But here's the thing. He's a crook and a con man, and he wants to be a king. Yes, the system really is rigged, but Trump's not unrigging it. He's re-rigging it for himself. What do you make of that?
All of this language suggests irregularity. Corruption emphasizes that the system is fundamentally sound, but there's irregular behavior taking place. Rigging, the system would otherwise be fair apart from the rigging that's taking place. And of course, why is it always talked about in these terms? Because the way the system ordinarily operates has to be defended, at least an image of the way the system ordinarily operates. And that's how you get people to settle for administrative reforms. You tell them that you are just trying to make the administrative system operate the way that it's supposed to. You're removing the corruption or the impurities within it so that it will function in a tighter way. It's a critique which reinforces the thing that it ostensibly critiques.
Yeah, only listen, he gives it away. I mean, he says the system really is rigged, but Trump's not unrigging it. He's re-rigging it for himself. Well, wait, hold a second. Who had it rigged before? Like that gives away way too much. He's abandoned the position, and they have to, right? He's abandoned the position of saying, America's already great. The Biden administration was a smashing success.
The old John McCain line that the fundamentals of the economy are sound is just no longer viable political speech.
Right. And just transfer that over to the fundamentals of our democracy are fundamentally sound. That's no longer politically viable either in either party. So, but I do think once you say, oh, well, Trump is re-rigging it. I mean, that's true. I think ultimately that, like, for instance, the way he cleaned house with the USAID, it's not to get the intelligence agencies out of our international aid system, but rather to make sure that those kinds of operations are being done in the service of whatever the hell Trumpism is.
The implication is that political struggle over the way the system works can be just equated with criminal behavior. Corruption is potentially criminal behavior. So the ordinary struggles over how the system works and over what the relationship should be between electeds and civil servants, the continuous struggles that mark this kind of democracy, that mark state capitalism, these ordinary struggles have to be framed as crimes to conceal the degree to which they're ordinary and to which they pervade the entire history of the system.
I would just
always got to be some image of it that doesn't involve this.
As a propagandist for socialism, I would just say that there is truth to the idea that the ordinary operations of this system include an ordinary level of crime and corruption. That so we should, and that when those things are exposed, it shows, I guess, that the consensus within the political class is breaking down. Was when we start to have all the ordinary level of crime, like taking free plane tickets from Turkey or something like that.
If you feel like the system doesn't work, then but you're still stuck within the paradigm of it, then all you can do is propose to purify it in various ways.
Right. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if we're concerned about crime, we should accept that crime or corruption within the system. We should also ask ourselves, why is it always there? Why is it ordinary? I'm not saying that we could, that it could continue as it is and not be corrupt in this ordinary way, but rather the opposite. Someone says, RIP Zero Books. Did Zero Books go under? I'll look into that in between. But if you want to keep Sublation Media going, go join us on the Patreon. Today, Ben and I will have a second hour in the Parrot Room, which will come out probably around 11 or 11:30, will be, that's after we've recorded it and I have time to post it. Thanks everyone for watching today. We will tell you more about how Trump is destroying America next week, I'm sure. And with that, I'm going to end this stream the same way it came in, with the same, with the outro that's the same as the intro. Here it is.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential